Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Kirkpatrick, and today I'll be doing my presentation on a hantavirus outbreak that took place in Oregon in June of last year. So, to start off with, what are hantaviruses? These are RNA enzootic viruses, which are able to maintain persistent infection within their hosts, which are typically small mammals such as rodents, shrews, moles, and bats. These hantaviruses are in the family Bunyaviridae and are in the genus Hantavirus. And this hantavirus genus contains some of the most important zoonotic pathogens known to humans, and they have been studied extensively, but there's still a lot that we don't know. And it's interesting to note that unlike most members of the Bunyaviridae family, the hantaviruses are not vector-borne diseases, but instead these are transmitted between their hosts through either aggressive interactions or through inhalation of rodent droppings, which is how humans are most commonly exposed to this virus and how humans become infected with this. So as I mentioned earlier, the um, the hosts of hantaviruses are typically small mammals, such as rodents, but these hosts don't exhibit any symptoms of disease. But the spillover to humans can cause one of two serious illnesses, such as hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome, or HPS, or hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, or HFRS. And as I stated earlier, human infection most often occurs when humans inhale infectious particles from the rodent droppings. And it's also suspected that one of the primary drivers of these hantavirus diseases in humans is directly related to the population density of rodent hosts. And there are two primary infections that are associated with hantaviruses. And the first one is hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, and this is more commonly found in Asia and Europe. And the other primary infection is hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome, and this is more commonly found in the Americas. Um, and it's important to note that the main known disease burden of hantaviruses in the old world, which would be more like Asia and Europe, um, is the hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, and it's caused by um, Myotis rattus and Apodemus-borne hantaviruses, and that in the Americas, um, as I said earlier, hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome is more common, and this is caused by a sigmodontine-borne hantaviruses. And with hantaviruses, there is no human-to-human transmission, and hantaviruses are transmitted horizontally within the reservoir populations. Getting into a little bit about the hantavirus genome, the genome is made up of 3 negative sense single-stranded RNAs that share a 3' terminal sequence of the 3 genome segments. And these 3 segments encode the nucleoprotein and envelop glycoproteins. And the size of the hantavirus genome is 11,845 nucleotides. And the hantavirus virions are typically spherical in nature, and their diameter usually averages between 80 to 120 nanometers. And for replication, these hantaviruses generally infect endothelial, epithelial, macrophage, follicular dendritic, and lymphocyte cells through the attachment of the viral glycoprotein to the host cell's surface receptors. Getting into a little bit of the history of, or more recent history of hantaviruses, The first major outbreak of hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome was reported during the Korean War, which took place from 1950 to 1953. And during this outbreak, more than 3,000 United Nations troops became afflicted with hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome. And the outbreak was blamed on the high level of contact between the rodent hosts and the soldiers who were residing outside. The second major outbreak took place in 1993 in the Four Corners of the United States. And so this disease was initially known as the Four Corners disease. However, when the pathogen that caused these infections was identified, the name was changed to Hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome, which is what it's known as today. For this outbreak, before this outbreak in 1993, hantavirus diseases were not recognized in the United States. But during this outbreak, there was a cluster of previously healthy residents that lived in the rural areas in the Four Corners region that suddenly died of acute unexplained respiratory distress. Um, and since the time of this outbreak in 1993 through March of 2007, there have been 465 hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome cases in the United States that have been reported to the CDC. And 35% of these reported cases have resulted in death. The greatest number of cases have been reported from New Mexico, with over half of the confirmed cases being reported from areas outside of the Four Corners area. Hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome cases have been reported in 30 of the United States, with the majority coming from the western half of the country, occurring in residents who live in more rural areas. Getting into the signs and symptoms of hantavirus, the incubation period for hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome is still not fully understood. However, it's thought that symptoms can appear anywhere from 1 to 8 weeks after the initial exposure takes place. And the early symptoms of hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome typically include fatigue, fever, and muscle aches. And these muscle aches are typically in larger muscle groups, like in your back, in your hips, or your thighs. So these symptoms are actually not unlike what's seen with, when you hear flu-like symptoms. These are not that different. The later symptoms of hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome can include coughing and shortness of breath. So unlike what we know about or what we don't know about hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome, it's known that hemorrhagic fever and renal syndrome symptoms usually appear within 2 weeks of that initial exposure. The early symptoms include severe and sudden headaches, back and abdominal pain, fever, chills, as well as blurred vision. And as the infection progresses, these symptoms can become much more severe and can include low blood pressure, acute shock, vascular leakage, and acute kidney failure. So, as far as preventing hantaviruses goes, there's no vaccine that's currently available on the market for hantaviruses, and this may be due to the fact that there aren't that many cases, even though it can cause serious illnesses. There's not very many cases of it, and you'll see when I talk about the surveillance of it later. But the CDC has stated that the best prevention strategy is to find ways to either minimize or eliminate contact with rodents in your home, workplace, or campsite. And hantaviruses, it's thought that there may be certain occupations that might be more at high risk than others. Hantaviruses are usually found in older buildings when they're being cleaned. So those workers there may be at a greater risk than the average person for exposure to the hantavirus pathogen. getting into the outbreak that I picked to do this presentation on, and I hesitate to really call it an outbreak. I guess it is since it's more than the expected number of cases, which we haven't seen a whole lot. But anyways, this took place in June of 2018 in Oregon, so last summer, and there was one confirmed case of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome in Deschutes County in Oregon, and the patient was a 67-year-old female who began experiencing flu-like symptoms on June 4th. A few days later, on June 7th, she was admitted to the ICU of St. Charles Redmond Hospital in Oregon. On June 9th, 2 days after she was admitted, she was placed on a ventilator, and then the next day, June 10th, she was actually airlifted to um, Oregon and Science Health and Sciences University on June 10th. Unfortunately, she died 4 days later on June 14th. The state of Oregon has conducted hantavirus surveillance since 1993, and in that time period, they have had 22 confirmed cases of hantaviruses. And this surveillance, even though that seems like a small number of cases, this surveillance program is really important because it's estimated that 35% of hantavirus patients will ultimately die from this infection. So there are several environmental factors that have the capacity to influence the transmission of these hantaviruses. Two of the most important environmental factors that impact the transmission of hantaviruses are climate change as well as landscape alteration. Um, for example, hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome epidemics have been found to be directly correlated with an increased abundance in rodent populations. And increases in rodent populations frequently occur in countries in Central Europe, for example. Rodent population increases in Central Europe are often due to what are known as mast years. And a mast year is simply a year in which there are abundant nuts on trees which eventually fall and accumulate on the ground. And these nuts provide nutrients to the rodents who live in the forest, and so we see a subsequent increase in the rodent population density in that area. Um, these high rodent population densities and subsequent epidemics of hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome are predicted by high summer temperatures for 2 years previous, as well as high temperatures in the fall for 1 year previous. And without this masting effect, or excuse me, it's known as the masting phenomenon, the population density of rodents in Central Europe would only have moderate variation from year to year. Um, and this small variation would not allow for these hantaviruses to be transmitted efficiently. For hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome, one of the factors that's been the most extensively studied and has been shown to be a predictor of hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome outbreaks is rainfall. And a high rainfall increases growth of vegetation, raises rodent population densities, which leads to increasing the probability that humans will encounter rodents, and therefore that would logically lead to an increase in the number of hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome cases. For example, in the southwest region of the United States, it has been observed that with an increase in rainfall, there is subsequently an increase in plant growth, and then there's an increase in deer moose. And so we see infection prevalence and cases of hantavirus cardiopulmonary syndrome also rise. Um, and these effects are even more clear after the El Nino Southern Oscillation events, which lead to dry and arid conditions. And these conditions are unfavorable for these hosts, and it causes them to disperse to a larger perimeter, um, which which means that um, more people could be exposed to and encounter these rodents who are infected with hantaviruses. Additionally, there are also three climate cycles that are likely to have an impact on hantavirus reservoir interactions. And as I mentioned earlier, one of them is El Nino Southern Oscillation events, and the other two are um, Pacific Decadal oscillations as well as the North Atlantic Oscillation. And these three cycles are important because they impact plant production, small mammal reproduction, as well as vertebrate predator activity. So I've kind of already alluded to impacting plant production as well as small mammal reproduction. The plant production leads to more nutrients, which leads to increases in the population densities of these rodent hosts. So I won't harp on that anymore. So going off of what I was talking about on the previous slide, hantavirus rodent hosts are also vulnerable to changes in climate, and this means that the persistence of the hantaviruses outside of the reservoir is not only dependent on temperature, but it's also dependent on humidity as well. And there are climate change is not the only um, environmental factor that has the capacity to affect the transmission of hantaviruses. Other factors include changes in biodiversity, human activities, which have an impact on climate change as well as biodiversity. And then another area where there's a significant research gap is that of predation. Um, Studies have pointed out that it is likely that predation has been neglected to be studied as a very important factor in the transmission of hantaviruses, and I will go into that in more detail on the next slide. So, as temperature changes, the environmental abundance of viruses changes as well. And as I explained earlier, the warmer temperatures that drive an abundance of nuts impact the population density of the rodent hosts are likely to have an impact on the disease occurrence from hantavirus exposure. And now getting into the areas of future research that I talked about, predation is one of the ones that is expected to be one of the most significant research areas moving forward with hantavirus transmission studies. Um, and research has said that studying the effects of predation are going to be critical in predicting risk for humans. Um, However, currently these studies on predation are limited, um, but so we don't know the true impact of predation on hantaviruses at this point. But the line of thinking for why this is important is that predators are going to limit the number of the rodent hosts. And since rodent hosts are going to limit pathogen numbers, um, and pathogen numbers in turn are going to determine the disease incidence, if we can find how how that how predation fits into the scheme of transmission of hantavirus, we may be able to mitigate some of that risk. Even though there's not a lot of cases, there are certain occupations that do have, or at least appear to have significantly higher risks than others, and we need to work to protect those groups of people. And that is all I have for my presentation. Here are my references, and Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.